Dr. Broers, happy to see you, happy to have you in our program. We've already prepared a set of questions which are mostly based on your book. Although you provide a lot of factors that trigger and keep alive the current rivalry in the South Caucasus, how do you think, is this a rivalry between Armenia and Azerbaijan, or Armenians and Azerbaijanis? How do you see the ratio of top-down and bottom-up process that maintain this conflict as a hot one?
Well, it's good to see you too, Rusif. Thank you for inviting me to appear on your program. Yes, the ratio of top-down and bottom-up influences, this is a key debate in the social science literature on ethnic conflict. To what extent does ethnic conflict arise when elites manipulate popular sentiments and create conflict to further their own political goals? Or to what extent does conflict kind of rise up from the masses, as it were, reflecting popular emotions, grievances, and affective dispositions? I think with the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, you've had a varying proportion of bottom-up and top-down factors over time. When we look at the emergence of the conflict in the late 1980s, I think we have to be careful with elite-focused theories. Clearly, political elites were not in control of events that for many of them spelled the end of their political careers. There were very deeply embedded grievances and affective dispositions amongst Armenians and Azerbaijanis towards each other. Each group was the largest, most significant proximate group for the other across a range of contexts. And so you had a very high degree of popular mobilization before the emergence of nationalist or ethnic elites as such. So in that sense, I would contrast the Armenian-Azerbaijani case with that of Serbs and Croats, for example, as examined by Chip Gagnon in his book, The Myth of Ethnic War. Later on, I think the quota of top-down influence becomes higher. The Karabakh narrative became the cornerstone of state and nation building processes across the divide. I think there was a moment in the mid-90s elites did attempt a different kind of discourse. There were efforts in this direction by Levon Ter-Petrosyan in particular, but also Heydar Aliyev. And these efforts were actually rejected by elite factions, representatives of the elite across each side. So here we do see an element, particularly on the winning side, on the Armenian side, where the Karabakh narrative was a route to political power. So I think there is a kind of a sub-question: are these two peoples incompatible? Is this about nation states, or is it about communities that are kind of incompatible as such? It's obviously, we look at the outcomes of the war in autumn of last year. No representatives of one nationality remain. Changes hands, and the war of last year kind of confirmed that principle. So, it begs the question, are these two peoples incompatible? And of course, I would strongly reject that analysis. That's what social scientists would call primordialism. There are no incompatible peoples or ethnicities. What's incompatible are the narratives, the ideologies, and the stories that get told. And I think the tragedy is that the stories, the story of sovereignty for Armenian and Azerbaijani nation states has been told as a monologue, excluding the other. So when we talk about Armenians and Azerbaijanis in the Russian or Soviet empires or in Georgia, there are narratives, there are stories of coexistence and cohabitation. But when we talk about sovereign Armenian and Azerbaijani nation states, there are no such stories.
Your book lays out a number of distinct geopolitical visions by the belligerent parties, with regard to Karabakh, namely Augmented Armenia and Greater Armenian Homeland versus Azerbaijanism or White Azerbaijanism. While Augmented Armenia and the more radical narratives proved to be dominant in Armenia and among the diaspora Armenians, one could also notice the gradual revival of the compliant Armenian discourse, which was increasingly being expressed by some notable Armenian politicians and statespeople. How much have these competing visions been shaped throughout and in the aftermath of the war?
Yeah, in my book, I discuss these different visions, these different geopolitical visions of both Armenia and Azerbaijan. So in the Armenian case, I contrast what I call compliant Armenia, a vision of Armenia that was promoted and put forward by the Pan-Armenian national movement in the 1990s, which was a national project to normalize Armenia's geopolitics and to liberate Armenia of the geopolitics of eternal enemies and friends. And obviously in that vision, Karabakh has quite an ambiguous place. Contrasting with that, I talk about this idea of augmented Armenia, which is the expansive Armenian ethnic space that was under Armenian control by the end of the Karabakh war. Over the post-war period, it was augmented Armenia that became hegemonic in Armenian geopolitical culture. Although I would argue that compliant Armenia made a comeback in the Velvet Revolution of April 2018, which was a revolution obviously about political participation and clean government. So when we look now at the outcomes of the Second Karabakh War, as I argued in a recent piece for the Analyticon Journal for the Stepanakert Press Club, both compliant and augmented Armenians have been defeated in a sense. Augmented Armenia has disappeared from the map with the deoccupation of the territory surrounding the former autonomous oblast. But this idea of a normalized Armenia, compliant Armenia, is also clearly under threat. And it's very ambiguous now as to which of these visions is going to win out. Compliant Armenia has made a comeback in a lot of the debates that we've seen over the last 3 months. Girar Libaridian in particular, articulating a very eloquent case around the problematic gap between Armenian dreams and realities. But what I would emphasize here is the significance and importance of what Azerbaijan now does. The more that Armenia feels vulnerable, feels dominated by Azerbaijan, the more difficult it will be for a compliant Armenia, for a normalized Armenia in terms of its geopolitics to emerge. And so I think the question is, what kind of Armenia does Azerbaijan want to see? And what can Azerbaijan do to enable different pathways for Armenian geopolitics? So in that sense, I think it's a question for both nations.
To keep the balance, let's also cover what you've identified as white Azerbaijanism as well. A narrative that puts forward Azerbaijani claims on Yerevan or Zangezur, let's say. In this regard, how do you believe the white Azerbaijani's perspective will still prevail in the post-war period, with Azerbaijani government increasing its claims on the present-day Armenia after the victory, or peace-building initiatives will be priority instead?
So this idea of what is white Azerbaijanism? As you know, the official doctrine of Azerbaijan since 1993 has been Azerbaijanism. So this is a state ideology focused on the territory of the Republic of Azerbaijan. So contrasting a nation-state space from the wider ethno-space, which of course includes large parts of Iran in particular. So in my book, I talk about how over the last 15 years, we've seen a different kind of interpretation, what I call wide Azerbaijanism, which is essentially focused on the idea that Armenia is an artificial construct on what were previously Azerbaijani lands. And so wide Azerbaijanism is essentially a proposition that Armenians are recent arrivals in the South Caucasus, relatively speaking, and therefore Armenia itself is something that is inauthentic as a nation state on what were previously Turkic lands. So I would argue that this is, in fact, still the dominant framework. In my work, I've looked at how this narrative is reflected in textbooks in schools. It's reflected in maps. If you look of Azerbaijan, place names in Armenia have a Turkic equivalent, which is a kind of a reminder. It's flagging that there is a kind of an underlayer or a palimpsest of Azerbaijani ethnic identity to many of the places in Armenia, including Yerevan, of course. And I would add that, this idea has featured in speeches as recently as the Victory Parade after the Second Karabakh War. So I think this is, of course, not the official doctrine of Azerbaijan. There's no strategic concept, as you highlighted, on this. Yet it's an idea that's quietly encouraged, or perhaps not so quietly, and is tolerated. And so, I think one has to be careful about, suggesting that this is simply empty rhetoric. These ideas, once you plant these ideas about ownership over territory, they can take on a momentum and life of their own. And we've seen that in the Armenian case. It became very difficult to refer to the territories around the autonomous Oblast in Nagorno-Karabakh as anything other than liberated territories. And so I think about how these rhetorics of territorial ownership can get out of control. And I think, I draw attention to the irony of wide Azerbaijanism. It essentially replicates very similar patterns on the Armenian side. And so what we've got are these two nation states that are essentially constantly undermining and denying the other's right to exist, its borderedness, its sense of self. And that's tragic.
One of the chapters of your book, you talk about the peculiar asymmetric power between Azerbaijan and Armenia, but against your predictions, Armenia's advantages position in the theater of the conflict, the deterrent strategic posture and preferential access to Russia's arms market proved to be insufficient to sustain the balance with Azerbaijan. Were there any factors, the significance of which you miscalculated in this respect? What about the part in which you mentioned the interest asymmetry between the sides? You contend that the war in Karabakh was only a matter of choice for the Azerbaijani government, whereas for Armenia it's a matter of survival. As of witnessing the extent of public support in Azerbaijan, especially in summertime, and during the military operations, of course, do you still hold the same beliefs?
Yeah, so this is, in one of the chapters in my book, I examine this paradox of how come it is that this long-term rivalry between two states is sustained in conditions of quite a deep power asymmetry. Azerbaijan's obviously many times larger than Armenia, considerably greater military purchasing power, a larger army, and so on. And I borrowed this concept of truncated asymmetry from the work of T.V. Paul, a scholar of the India-Pakistan rivalry. And he uses this concept to explain the fact that Pakistan, which is many times smaller than India, has nevertheless managed to sustain a rivalry for more than half a century with much larger, much more powerful India. And so in that sense, this idea of truncated asymmetry is not really about predicting the outcome of war, Pakistan has lost several wars with India. Nevertheless, the rivalry between the two states is sustained. So in the book, I argue that this power asymmetry, this very strange kind of strategic interaction, describes the situation perhaps from 2005 up until last year, when indeed this pattern was broken. And so when we look at the factors behind that, I think there has been an underestimation of Azerbaijan's improvements in terms of its military performance. I wrote the book essentially in 2017, early 2018. I finished it just as the Velvet Revolution was happening. And at that time, I think there wasn't really an empirical basis for foreseeing the improvements in operational performance that we saw in the Second Karabakh War. I think we also perhaps overestimated Armenian capacities, and certainly the factors of terrain and deterrence collapsed in the war of last year. As political geographer Gerard Toll put it, sky beat mountain. In terms of dominance of the sky, beat the factor of terrain. But going beyond that, there are obviously other factors which broke this truncated asymmetry dynamic. The role of Turkey lending power to Azerbaijan across different dimensions. It's obviously controversial in Azerbaijan to talk about mercenaries, but if you had wanted to reduce the costly political impact of heavy casualties, then introducing mercenaries from another context would have been a good way to do that. And yet, for all that, I would still argue that Azerbaijan's victory was truncated. It was not a complete victory. And the third element of Armenia's truncated asymmetry strategy, which is Russia, still came in and prevented a complete defeat of the Armenian side. So I think the truncated asymmetry dynamic is still relevant. And with regards to the future, I don't think that we can exclude a return to asymmetric dynamics, many years from now. A lot depends on what we were discussing before in terms of how Azerbaijan in particular, because it decides more right now, the pathways that it chooses in its relationship with Armenia.
Of course, you just mentioned Russia and its involvement in the conflict. Do you believe Russia's pivotal deterrence, as you put it in your book, completely failed, or it has just evolved into a new level, bringing this conflict closer to the other ones in post-Soviet Eurasia? What do you think Russia's new policy model in the region will look like?
Yeah, it's a huge question. In my book, I discuss this idea of pivotal deterrence, that Russia's strategy has been to prevent a large-scale war through a range of strategies that keep Armenia and Azerbaijan uncertain about what it might do in the event of a war, and thereby restraining them, inducing caution and restraint. That paradigm, that strategy has been broken largely through Turkey's entry into the conflict in support of Azerbaijan. That gave Azerbaijan, I think, the capacity and the determination to reject Russia's deterrent strategy, Russia's control over the conflict system. But I don't think that this new be stable. I think it's a very interesting question. Did Russia win the Second Karabakh War? Obviously, it appears to now have a monopoly or near monopoly on policing the new arrangements, on providing security. But I actually think it's Turkey that wins more in the long term. Turkey has demonstrated that it can play the role of a security actor. It plays a secondary role in the peacekeeping arrangements, as we know. But I think the main military benefit is the very vivid demonstration of superior Turkish military tech and doctrine during the actual conflict. But beyond that, Turkey has other ways of penetrating the region. A common identity with Azerbaijan, very close kind of cultural basis for that relationship, and then regional cooperation with Georgia. So you see a wider bandwidth, I think, for Turkish soft power to come into the region, whereas Russia, this war represented, I think, a kind of failure of more hegemonic forms of exercising regional influence. So, the ideal for Russia would have been for its deterrent strategy to be sufficient to prevent a new war. Introducing a peacekeeping operation under kind of emergency conditions, I think has a sense of a last resort about it. In terms of the future, I would expect Russia's strategy to encourage a kind of illiberal regional model along the lines that we see perhaps in Central Asia. I think we're seeing elements of that in this 3+3 discussion about regional powers interacting with the powers in the South Caucasus itself. But I think, and I'll finish on this, I think the key point here is that the rivalry between Armenia and Azerbaijan is the key opening for Russian influence. And the more that Armenia and Azerbaijan continue on a path of antagonism and antagonistic relations, the more the pathway is open for Russia to penetrate the region. So in that sense, I think the most important three in the 3+3 should be Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, rather than outside powers.
That's interesting. But what about the role of the West? Do you consider the latest development in Karabakh as a strategic defeat of the West? Do you believe the transatlantic community has effective ways to challenge Moscow's and Ankara's leading role both in the conflict and post-war process?
If we were to talk about a strategic defeat for Euro-Atlantic powers, I think that would imply that there had been a much more defined mission, intentionality, interests that the West had been fighting for and fighting against Russia for in this conflict. And I just don't think that that's the case. This conflict has been an exception in Eurasia in the sense that Euro-Atlantic powers have not been confronting Russia in a direct way. On the contrary, they've been in a kind of uneasy alliance with a common interest with Russia in preventing an all-out war. But in doing that, they have effectively ceded leadership over time within the Minsk group to Russia. This isn't to take anything away from the many excellent American and French diplomats who've been engaged in the Minsk group. But the broader geopolitical flow has been for Russia to become the primus inter pares, the first among equals within the Minsk group. But that relationship never went beyond this kind of symbiosis. It never developed into a more positive, intentional relationship or alliance for peace. And so I think the outcomes of the Second Karabakh War effectively recognize a pre-existing reality. And when it comes to moving forward, I don't think that there is really interest or intent to challenge Russia on the arrangements that have now been put in place. I think there is a more pragmatic and more realistic intention, perhaps to multilateralize this new context, recognizing that Russia and Turkey together don't have the bandwidth or capacities to address all of the issues that are arising now. And so, I would question any sense of Western Russian deep antagonism on this conflict. And in terms of what can challenge Russian and Turkish domination, I think that can only come from within. It's only when South Caucasus actors desist from leveraging external actors' power in their rivalries with one another that you'll see a real challenge to external domination and projects in hegemonic regionalism.
How do you estimate the chances for a genuine resolution and peace-building processes? Are they seeming higher or lower than before? What conditions should be fulfilled to make them happen?
I mean, the very idea of what is a genuine resolution is itself, I think, very much contested. On the Azerbaijani side, in many ways, I think there is now a discourse that the conflict is resolved, that we've seen already a genuine resolution. On the Armenian side, of course, this is not a genuine resolution, and there is a desire to foreground issues such as status, the core issue, I think, that has been contested since the beginning of this conflict. Given that, we now don't really have a framework within which that issue can be discussed. The future of the Minsk group, of the Minsk process, is uncertain. And beyond that, I don't think that we're going to see necessarily a very hospitable or enabling environment for peace building. I think what we saw after the first Karabakh war was that a one-sided military outcome became a central pillar in the legitimacy of the regime that developed in Armenia. And I think that something similar could potentially happen now on the Azerbaijani side. And that may create problems in terms of an open discussion on peace building. On the flip side, I think there are potentially perhaps three factors that would militate, that's the wrong word, that would potentially enable peace building. The first of these is that what we've seen over the last 3 months is a very hard process of region building. But for that to be viable and for that to be legitimate ultimately, for it to deliver for the people who've actually got to live within this system, you need soft regionalism. You need community relations, and for that you need peace building. So in that sense, that's an opening for peace building. A second factor is that I think there was a degree to which the first Karabakh war was romanticized, especially on the Armenian side as the winning party. I think that romanticization has now gone. A new generation have seen war close up. And I think perhaps there is a realization of the devastating cost. More than 6,000 killed, more than 10,000 wounded. Those losses are now, I think, very present in the consciousness of people across the divide. And thirdly, perhaps this realization that hasn't necessarily ended the conflict. The issues that were contested previously are still contested, even though others have been resolved. And the paradox that this war has actually resulted in a new phase of external influence and external entry into the region. And so there's not really a straight line between war and national emancipation. And so perhaps there'll be more of a consciousness that negotiation is a route to national and personal sovereignty. So that's what I hope in terms of the scope for peace building.
Thank you very much, Dr. Broers, for your interesting and comprehensive analysis.
Thank you very much, Rusif, and all the best to your work at the Top Center.
Yeah, it was a very pleasure to talk to you.
Okay, thank you.